The anime begins in the demon realm, where the hero's party is facing off against the demon king, who proves to be extremely resilient and immensely powerful. One of the party members is exhausted. However, his companions manage to stop the demon king's attacks and the hero lunges at him, driving his sword into his head before everyone joins together for one final assault, finally defeating the demon king. Time passes and now all the heroes are celebrated throughout the kingdom. As a reward for helping and aiding the hero, the king grants the sages of fire, earth, water, and wine the title of the Four Emperors, a title reserved only for the most powerful mages. The Wind Sage is surprised since the title of emperor is normally reserved for those of noble blood, but even though it's only a title limited to the world of magic, it's still being granted to them. When it's the Wind Sage's turn before being honored, the king lets him know that even though he isn't the most powerful in the world of magic, he will still be granted the title, and from that day on he will be called the Lightning Emperor. He bursts into tears and thanks the king while everyone present quickly begins praising him. The Lightning Emperor thinks that his 40 years of magical study have finally been recognized, and in such a magnificent way. Years go by. Now the Lightning Emperor, whose name is actually Eftel, is interrupted by his young disciple who lets him know breakfast is ready. He thanks his little disciple Merlin and remarks that it's a great day for training. A while later we see Eftel training both Merlin and several other children. He has them balance a stone on their heads while concentrating on maintaining their magic circle. Once they finish that, he orders them to cast a level 4 spell. Merlin asks him why he doesn't rest a little, but Eftel replies that it isn't necessary since he isn't tired. She simply watches him with a hint of worry, while Eftel, seeing her expression, recalls that after defeating the demon king he found a demon mother and her small baby, and thinks that even though she surely doesn't remember it, he killed many members of her clan, which makes him feel unworthy of the worried way she looks at him. He tells the children it's time to keep practicing the level 4 spell, though Merlin asks him to teach them the level 6 spell instead. Eftel asks her why she's in such a hurry, and she replies that she wants to give her best in order to prove she's the star pupil of the great master Eftel, the Lightning Emperor. Eftel lets her know that the most important thing is building a solid foundation, and Merlin understands, though she replies that she has to hurry. Eftel looks at her with some confusion, but she asks him to forget about it. A little later, we see her looking somewhat anxious at the edge of a forest. She works up some courage and heads inside, making her way deeper and deeper until she finally reaches a cave in the middle of the woods. She feels she must defeat the monster inside that cave in order to become the Lightning Emperor's best student, so that she can teach everyone in her master Eftel's place, finally allowing him to rest and relax. Unfortunately, after a scene change, we see Merlin desperately fleeing from the cave monster since her level 4 magic proved useless, though in truth she has no intention of giving up and decides to go all in. She summons the wind spirits and recites the incantation to strike the monster directly, attempting to cast a level 6 spell. She's thrilled to see she managed to summon the spell. However, the monster keeps advancing as if nothing happened. It knocks her backward, and just as she's about to meet a grim end, a huge roar echoes through the area. Turning to look, Merlin sees her master, who looks quite irritated since he has already told her many times to stay away from that forest. Merlin apologizes while Eftel lets her know that she's his most talented student but that she's too impatient, and power gained in haste is very fragile. However, as Eftel is speaking, the monster gets back on its feet. Merlin panics at the sight of it and fear keeps her from speaking, though Eftel senses it and uses a level 10 spell to incinerate the poor wolf. Later that night, Merlin mentions that her master is amazing. Eftel tells her to go to sleep, but as she's about to head to her room, Eftel starts coughing and spits up blood. He asks Merlin if she already noticed, and she replies that she had, and that's why she'd been so eager to learn quickly. He's surprised to realize that's why she'd been pushing herself so hard. Merlin asks him to take care of himself and recommends he rest as much as he can, but Eftel gets up and reveals that he doesn't have much time left, so he can't afford to rest. She asks him why he keeps going, and Eftel strokes her head and tells her he wants to train talented students who will succeed him, just as she will. He tells her that in the past he wanted to become the strongest man in the world, every mage's dream, but unfortunately he never managed it, because reaching the top was simply impossible for him. Merlin replies that isn't true since the Lightning Emperor is the strongest of them all, and that very day he cast a level 10 spell with ease. Eftel simply thinks he understands why she'd say that, though compared to the other, younger sages, he alone, the oldest of them, had struggled against the Demon King. The next day, one of his students pounds on the door, and when Eftel goes out to answer, the boy tells him that the Flame Emperor has finished his theory on magical aptitude. He hands over all the details, and as Eftel skims through them, he's stunned, remarking that it's truly worthy of the Flame Emperor since that theory was believed to be impossible. The boy asks him what he plans to do now, and Eftel decides to put his old colleague's theory to the test. He gathers all his students and puts the theory into practice. First, he places a strand of hair from the test subject into each tube and they light up, changing color according to each element: earth, fire, water, and wind. The children notice the blue and green tubes glowing, and Eftel explains that, according to the theory, the intensity of the light and depth of color indicate a rank somewhere between E and S since green and blue are glowing the brightest. He assumes that means the subject has an S rank in water and wind. One of the students points out that the other two tubes aren't glowing much, which might mean the magic for those elements falls in the C or B rank. Merlin watches this and comments that, although it may not mean much to her, the man who raised her since she was a baby knows perfectly well that she has a strong affinity for water, wind, and earth as well. The current method of learning magic involves practicing basic spells of every type and after some time determining which one suits you best. But with this new method, it will be possible to know someone's greatest talent from birth, allowing young mages to become far stronger. Eftel asks the kids to test him as well. Merlin tells him it isn't necessary, though the rest of the children are dying of curiosity. Eftel wants to try it because even though he never managed to reach the highest level of magic, he wants to know if he ever actually had the talent to achieve it, since he worked hundreds of times harder than anyone, far harder than any other emperor. That's why he wants to know if he might have had great talent for some element after all. However, the tubes don't light up, and the boy from before comments that, according to the theory, if none of them show a specific color, it means the subject has no aptitude at all. He adds that it's impossible for Eftel to lack it. Merlin agrees, and Eftel thinks that having no aptitude would mean none of the spirits favor him. So then, why didn't the tubes light up when he's the Lightning Emperor? Merlin suggests maybe they made a mistake with the procedure and recommends trying again, and Eftel, worried, asks them to redo it, certain they must have made an error. However, no matter how many times they tried, the tubes never changed color. He's left frustrated, wondering why. He knows perfectly well that he was always slower than everyone else at learning magic, but now he can finally understand the reason he could never surpass the other emperors. The only explanation is that he never had any aptitude for magic at all. His frustration begins to take its toll and his illness flares up again. Time passes and Eftel's condition worsens. Merlin tries to help him, but he asks her to wait outside. In his room, Eftel keeps thinking that he always believed he could reach the highest levels of magic, but he could never break through that wall called talent. With that result, his hopes died. He feels ashamed of being so pathetic. He thinks that if only he'd had a little more time, he might have changed something, but all his effort amounted to nothing, and sadly, Eftel ends up dying frustrated. Suddenly, something happens, and he awakens the ability of a second reincarnation. Now in a strange white space, he recalls that 50 years had already passed, and that he'd forgot he even had that ability. He mentions this to a mysterious figure he'd met in that space after having taken his own life in a different world. This figure, a strange, well-endowed goddess, welcomes him and lets him know that his unbreakable ability was what allowed him to push himself to his limit. He finally understands why he could never give up, and now she tells him that the time has come for his second reincarnation, and that he can once again gain extra starting abilities. She asks him what he thinks about doubling his growth rate, but he replies that it isn't necessary since he still retains his magical knowledge and only needs more time to keep pushing himself and improving. She tells him that it's very much like him that despite lacking magical aptitude, he still managed to become one of the 4 emperors, and that was thanks to his sheer force of will. She asks if he's ready and he says yes, thanking her for this second chance at life. After a flash of light, Eftel wakes up in a small body. He sits up, startled, and his memories quickly come flooding back. Leaving the room, he goes to look at himself in the mirror and is immediately hugged by his mother, who also calls him Eftel. He realizes that, thanks to his second reincarnation ability, he's now living his third life. By the time he turns 4, the memories of the old Eftel begin returning to him, and now, in this third chance at life, he's determined to master magic. That morning, he remembers the method for testing magical aptitude, so without wasting any time, he runs off to try it. Unfortunately, just like in his previous life, the same thing happens, and while he's lost in thought in the garden, he spots an enormous black dragon flying overhead. Noticing its crimson eyes, he wonders if someone must have made it angry, and sure enough, the knights come charging in right behind it. Eftel instinctively starts running, but then remembers he's no longer at his peak. He's only 4 years old, so what could he possibly do? He regrets that if only he'd known this would happen, he would have reincarnated into a body capable of using magic. However, he remembers his own original spell, the one he created himself, level 10 Eftel. When he tries it, he manages to cast it, and a powerful magic circle appears before him, disintegrating the dragon in an instant and leaving Eftel completely stunned as he realizes he was reborn into this world able to use the magic from his past life at its very fullest. About 3 years pass after Eftel was reincarnated into that body, retaining his past life consciousness, and by this point he has discovered that he's in the same world he lived in before just 400 years later. The next day, a blonde man arrives at the house, who turns out to be Eftel's older brother named Frasier, who hands his mother some money for the month. He then walks over to his little brother and is surprised to see him studying some rather interesting and quite complicated books, all at such a young age. Seeing that his little brother is interested in magic books, he lets him know that he'll bring some as a gift next time he visits. Eftel gets excited and their mother remarks that he's just like his father. Curious, Eftel asks his brother when he'll get to meet their father. Frasier apologizes though, since their father is very busy and finds it hard to make time. Eftel feels a pang of sadness since he doesn't know his father, but he knows the man is a very important figure in the world of magic in the Blue Kingdom. The Duke Orcott, who happens to be a descendant of Eftel's past self, that is, the Lightning Emperor, so he's quite curious to find out what he's like. However, since his mother has no magical aptitude, she's looked down on by his father's wife and the rest of the concubines. Since it's a family of mages and his father's wife despised them for lacking magical aptitude, she banished them to a remote area. He's essentially a bastard son. Frasier feels for him and mentions he'll talk to their father about it, while Eftel thinks about how his brother Frasier is actually the second son of the Duke Orcott's wife, who took pity on them and decided to look after them. Still, Eftel doesn't care about his circumstances as long as he can study magic. A little later, over tea, Frasier asks him what he plans to do in the future with everything he's studying, and an excited Eftel blurts out that he's a descendant of a legendary mage, and that, once he turns 15, he plans to go to the academy in the capital to study magic. His mother quickly covers his mouth since he's talking too much, and Frasier tells him that, just like their mother, he also has no magical aptitude, something Frasier knows all too well since his brother's lack of aptitude is common knowledge. Their mother mentions she'd been thinking of sending him to fencing school, and Frasier thinks it's a great idea. Eftel complains because he doesn't want to learn fencing, but Frasier lets him know that, believe it or not, he was the top of his class at military school, and admits that he originally chose that academy because he wanted to rebel against his family of mages, but he feels it was the right call since magic swordsmen are quite rare and the army treats them very well. Since he happens to have some free time that day, he asks Eftel if he'd like to give it a try. Their mother gets excited and pulls him into her chest, muffling his response, letting Frasier know she'd be more than happy for him to teach his little brother. Later on, Eftel is practicing swordsmanship and comes to understand why his older brother had been so insistent on teaching him general subjects and military science, since his brother's plan from the start had been to send him to military school. He figures his brother must be worried about his lack of magical aptitude, but that's not what he wants, so he musters up the courage to tell his brother that he actually wants to attend the Academy of Magic. His brother looks at him with sympathy and tells him that some people are good at certain things and bad at others. Eftel understands perfectly well that he has no magical aptitude, but he does have mana and can use magic. He wants to go no matter what, since after those 400 years he might be able to find some clue that will help him push past his limits. Frasier finally agrees, but on one condition. He'll cast a spell, and if his little brother somehow manages to replicate it, he himself will recommend him to the Academy of Magic. Frasier figures that, although it's a bit harsh, he hopes this will help his little brother see reality and come to terms with it. He tells him to pay close attention, and Eftel is thrilled. Frasier quickly begins casting, summoning the wind spirit Sylfield. He finally casts a level 2 spell that manages to cut down a tree, figuring that should surprise his little brother enough to make him understand he won't be able to get into the Academy of Magic. However, to his surprise, Eftel asks if that's really all he's got. Frasier asks what on earth he's talking about, since casting that spell takes an enormous amount of effort, but Eftel leaves him speechless by summoning a far more powerful spell without even needing to recite an incantation. Frasier's jaw drops as he wonders how on earth his 7-year-old little brother managed to do that, since he'd never heard of anything like it before, and only a sage who had trained for decades could possibly pull it off. He asks Eftel what he just did, and Eftel realizes it slipped out. He'd meant to copy his brother but ended up casting a spell of nearly level 4. Frasier panics since that kind of magic is extremely high-ranked, though Eftel can't quite understand the fuss, since to him that spell is quite low-level. Frasier asks how he can possibly use such advanced magic, and Eftel, knowing full well he can't simply say he reincarnated, makes up a story about adapting the knowledge and power he gained from his studies, confessing to his brother that he can actually reach as high as level 10. Frasier can't believe it, since that's considered lost technology, and he ends up fainting on the spot. Eftel meanwhile thinks that judging by his brother's reaction, something must be off in this world. He recalls that when he defeated the dragon, the knights were saying something about a god having saved them, calling it a miracle. He figures something must not be right in this era, and upon returning home to investigate, he discovers that magical civilization declined drastically over those 400 years, casting spells without an incantation is no longer considered common at all. That explains why his brother fainted. Just then, Frasier wakes up in a panic, still stunned by everything he saw. Eftel acts fast though, using his power of manipulation to make his brother believe that what he saw wasn't real, that he'd simply blown up a tree with an incredible spell, and a stray fragment had struck him in the head, knocking him out. Frasier starts laughing nervously, while Eftel decides from that day on to study magic in secret and to go along with his brother's plan about military school, at least for the time being. Even though he has no real intention of attending military academy. The unbreakable wolf from his past life has shaped his personality. Now the more he gets knocked down, the angrier he gets and the more he wants to learn. So over and over, day after day, he spends his time training with his brother until he turns 10, at which point he decides he wants to grow even stronger, well beyond magic in the martial arts as well. Those 3 years of training really paid off, and he figures that earning the title of the strongest magic swordsman isn't such a bad goal. After cutting down a tree trunk by the waterfall, he heads off to train with his brother, who has lately been teaching him to fight 3 times a week. When he meets up with him, Frasier lets him know that today will be a special training session since he's called in a special instructor to teach him his place. A huge bald man with a mustache shows up at the site. Frasier introduces him as Mr. Moria, a former commander of the Blue Kingdom's Knights. Moria tells him to attack and offers to let him land the first hit. Despite what he said though, Eftel can't find any opening in his stance at all and realizes this man is genuinely strong. Moria asks if he was only called out there to just stand around, though it's not that Eftel doesn't want to attack, he simply can't move. Seeing that he isn't moving, Moria charges at him. Eftel dodges quickly and realizing that raw strength alone won't be enough to overcome this man, decides to use physical enhancement. Moria compliments him, since being able to use that kind of enhancement at his age explains why Frasier recommended him. He mentions that he noticed while training him that despite lacking magical aptitude, every time he grips his sword there's mana flowing into his hand, and his internal control is surprisingly good, almost as if he were a true mage or even a sage. Eftel tenses up because, well, the old geezer actually had been a sage. Moria bursts out laughing, provoking Eftel's anger. He figures he could easily beat him if he used his magic, but there's no point in winning that way. He wants to defeat him in a real fight, so he charges at him. Moria lets him know though that he still lacks technique, lacks height and lacks muscle. The only thing missing was telling him he lacks everything. But Eftel has no intention of being humiliated by that old bald man, and while weathering his attack, he manages to dodge it and then uses Moria's own momentum against him, slamming him into the ground. For his part, Eftel thinks his body moved on its own, recalling that in his first life he learned how to do throws. Moria gets up and congratulates him, letting him know he passed the test. Frasier mentions he forgot to bring up one little detail. He reveals that Moria actually runs the military science school and serves as its director, which means that once Eftel turns 15, he'll be a student at a prestigious military academy, and their mother will be proud. Moria makes it very clear though that even though Eftel lost the fight, he won the sword duel. Eftel, for his part, wonders how on earth he let that happen. Some time later, Frasier notices the weather has turned quite bad, while Eftel, on the other hand, is out training, since no matter the rain he's always training, especially because rainy days are the best cover for using his magic without anyone seeing. Right at that moment, Frasier goes out looking for him since he just saw a bolt of lightning strike and reminds him he needs to be careful since next year he'll be starting school, so he'd better not get hurt. Eftel reflects that ever since that duel it was decided he'd be attending the military academy. In that world, people come of age at 15 and he's currently 14. But he has no intention of going to the military academy. Once he turns 15, he plans to run away from home and head to the Academy of Magic on his own. Just then though, his brother tells him he has some great news, and once they're back home their mother is overjoyed to hear that Eftel's father wants to meet him. She thanks Frasier for teaching his brother military science and fencing, and for making him strong enough that their father would finally take notice of him. Eftel though thinks there's no point in meeting a man who ignored him for 14 years. But seeing his mother so happy, along with his brother who has done so much for him all these years, he doesn't want to do anything to disappoint them. So sometime later he finds himself standing at the entrance of Duke Orkot's mansion, thinking that although he's really only there for his mother and brother, he's also curious to meet his own descendant. When they finally meet, the tension in the air is palpable and the situation is quite awkward, though Eftel steps forward and introduces himself to his father. His father, however, tells him to just call him Duke Orkot, since he has no intention of ever acknowledging him as he's brought nothing but shame to the family. Eftel can hardly believe he's being greeted this way after 14 years, but simply plays along and calls him Duke Orkot, who complains that he can't understand how, despite being a descendant of the Lightning Emperor, Eftel has no magical aptitude at all. He remarks that the Emperor must be turning in his grave, and Eftel thinks he actually agrees since he's just met his own descendant and the man is a complete jerk. He's ready to leave, but then Duke Orkot mentions he's heard Eftel received a special invitation to the military school, calling it great news. Seeing him laugh, Eftel wonders if, even though the man won't acknowledge him as his son, he's still happy for him as a father. He thinks maybe the man isn't so bad after all. But no, in reality, this guy is a piece of work, and he goes on to say it's good news because now he won't have to pay for Eftel's food, since going by invitation means free room and board, and starting from third year he'll even receive a stipend. As long as he doesn't embarrass the family name, everything will be fine. Eftel can hardly believe this man is his father, and that he only dragged him all the way there just to tell him that. Duke Orkot then turns to his son Joachim and tells him that, although he let that woman give birth on a whim, people might assume the boy is part of the family, so he wants Joachim to test whether he's strong enough not to embarrass them at school. Joachim gets a sadistic look on his face, thinking he now has the chance to teach that little lapdog a lesson, while Eftel finally understands exactly why he was brought there in the first place.